The National Judicial Council, under the chairmanship of the Chief Justice of Nigeria, Justice Kudirat Kekereekun, last week recommended 2 heads of court for compulsory retirement over judicial misconduct bordering on falsification of age. The 2 persons involved include the Chief Judge of Imo State, Justice T.E. Chukwuemeka Chikeka, and the Grand Cadi of Yobe State, Babagana Mahdi. According to a statement issued and signed by NJC's Deputy Director of Information, Kemi Babalola Ogedengbe, on Friday in Abuja, the council found that the Grand Cadi had 3 different dates of birth, December 10th, January 28th, and July, all in 1959, while his actual date of birth was 1952. The findings of the council, according to the statement, also revealed that Justice Chikeka has 2 different dates of birth, October 27th, 1956, and October 27th, 1958. This development seemingly reflects the consistent position of Chief Justice of Nigeria, Kudirat Kekereekun, since she was appointed by President Bola Tinubu earlier this year, that some judges are bringing the judiciary to disrepute. We'll be joined to have a chat around this by lawyer Adeyinka Olumide Fusika, who's a senior advocate of Nigeria.
Well, we will also speak with entrepreneur, seasoned public speaker, and business analyst Eno Ekpa, and we shall be focusing on what individuals and businesses will stand to benefit from the Business Analysis Summit coming up on November 7th for Lagos and December 7th for Abuja, and December 14th for Port Harcourt.
Indeed, and when that chat is over, we shall move on to speak with comedian and filmmaker Basketmouth in the company of producer and writer Ms. Vic, and they will be here to talk about their feature film, A Ghetto Love Story, which made its cinematic debut on Friday and is already creating a lot of awareness arising from its peculiar storyline. We shall, however, get the show rolling by looking back at top stories that made headlines this week on the week that was, and then wrap up with a review of newspaper headlines from across the country. It's going to be all that and more today on The Morning Show.
Well, welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. It's time now for the week that was. Let's take a look at the top stories that made headlines across the globe this week. And we're going to start here in Nigeria because President Bola Tinubu this week took his opportunity to speak at the G-20 summit in Brazil to endorse the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, an initiative spearheaded by Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Now, the initiative, signed by 81 countries, aims to tackle hunger and poverty on a global scale. Tinubu highlighted Africa's challenges, including terrorism, climate change, and food security, warning that Africa's neglect is a global threat. He called for urgent reforms in global financing, stressing the need for cheaper funding and fairer tax systems to support Africa's development. The Nigerian leader reaffirmed Nigeria's commitment to fighting poverty and called for international investment in education, health, and food security to lift Africa out of crisis.
A session devoted to fighting poverty and hunger. I am from Nigeria. It's better to give you the true picture of what's going on. In Africa, we have terrorism challenges, insecurity challenges that are preventing farmers to even go to their farm. We have problem in Sudan, displacing people. We have problem of climate change, flooding, destroying crops. And we have problem of protectionism. We have problems. It is very important to make it clear and louder here We have problem of out-of-school children. We have problem of funding free education or giving our children 1 meal a day in a classroom to even make them pay attention to school. Africa has that problem. And the problem is compounded by some other conflicts around the war in Ukraine and others, the war on Gaza Strip. That's poverty-driven problems. What do I do to help the small-scale industry? The cost of funding is expensive. What do I do to get power to industrialize my country? The cost of funding is extremely expensive. The developed world need to extend these promises that you have out here today. I must salute every one of you. But support the continent. The neglect of Africa is a danger to the rest of humanity. And we have to lift one another up.
Honestly, I find that speech to be uninspiring, not very comprehensive. You know, Nigeria went from a time where we were giving the Africa has come of age speech on the floor of the African Union when it was Murtala Mohammed, to come to an era of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu saying that Africa is being abandoned. We have a problem. We have a problem of this. We have a problem of that. And you have to ask, at some point in time, when would the leaders in Africa take responsibility for the problems that have been created by Africans themselves, or have been taken to this level by a lack of policy implementation, by a lack of comprehensive policy analysis? Just this week, the IMF said that Nigeria is one of the countries where the reforms are not working. And then the President Bola Ahmed Tinubu came out and replied the IMF and said, no, the policies are bearing fruit. And they're paying attention to the most vulnerable and those living in poverty. You know, he spoke about the problems with insecurity in the nation and that farmers can't go to their farmland. That's why we're having food inflation in harvest season, right? These things that are problems that we have, yes, but what are you doing to tackle them? The IMF came and said that children born in Nigeria today are 25% more likely to end up in poverty than children in non-resource-dependent countries like Rwanda. These are other African countries. We're not even talking about the West. Their lifespans are shorter. You know, Nigeria has the largest population of out-of-school children in the world, and this is something that President Tinubu is saying at the G-20, but also, what are you doing about that? Like, for me, I don't actually care about positioning in Brazil if you don't do policy implementation in Nigeria. Why, if you are so sure that you are putting the poor people ahead, if you're so sure that you're investing in our children, if you know that lack of investment in education leads to insecurity, leads to poor performance for the whole country in the future, then what are you doing now to make sure that that is tackled? I cannot pull one policy that they are touting themselves. We can talk about CNG, we can talk about the tax bill. I cannot say one policy in education that the president has put forward, but he's going to the world stage and saying that this is what matters to me. For me, what matters to you, you put your money where your mouth is, right? You put your actions where your mouth is. And I have not seen that from the president. I have not seen that in his positioning. I have not seen that in his policy. And I have not even seen that in their posturing. So for me, you know, at the G20, that's all nice and dandy. But I honestly, seeing the Nigerian president take that tone on the world stage, for me, is very disheartening. It's very heartbreaking. It just shows how much we've slid on the world totem pole. But beyond that, if the president is going to say that the people who are most important to him are the people who are going hungry, are the people who are living in poverty, then his policy should reflect that.
I totally agree with you. For me, I think that the first thing to do will be to congratulate the president for at least being on the world stage at the G-20, you know, immediately after receiving the Indian Prime Minister. And I think that it's a big deal, even though that might be the 30th, isn't it, international trip that the president will have done in barely 1.5 years. But it's a big deal that is at the G20, and he had the floor to cry for help. I think what he has done is to cry for help. I think it will have been perfectly in order to lay the blames to an appreciable extent, you know, at the door of the West when he said that Africa should not be neglected, and that the neglect is harming lives and nations in Africa. That will have been perfect. But then what will have also been necessary will be to say that most of the African countries that he was trying to speak for are at least, you know, 50, 60, a couple of them 70-something years as independent entities. And therefore, what has Africans, particularly African leaders themselves, achieved in those 60-something, 50-something, 70-something years? If he zeroes down to Nigeria, we're 64. He has done about 1.5 years in office. I'm not sure that what will be inspiring at this stage will be the type of cry for help, the type of Ekpa Dugbo kind of posturing that he took to the global stage. That's what it meant. That's what it sounded like.
Yes.
When you say that, let me start and establish what the issues are. We have terrorism, it started with. We have flooding, our kids can't go to school, our farmers can't go to farm. That's Ekpa Dugbo. You know, Adugbo here, being an area, is the global stage. You know, it's saying that don't let us perish. And I agree that the West or the global North have a role to play in our survival. But then before you talk of come to my rescue, how far have you gone? And a lot of people will not be in doubt as to the fact that many of our leaders in most of the African countries, but more especially in Nigeria, have contributed to the issues that we are dealing with. So I would have thought that the president will say to the world that in 1.5 years of my administration, add 8 years of the previous administration, which is of the same party, and hopefully of the same kind of values and manifestos that, you know, that this is what we have been able to do in 27 years of democracy in Nigeria. Many people didn't get that, and it didn't look like it spoke to what the next 2.5 years of his administration will do specifically to the people. He says that, what can I do? I need funding. What can I do? I don't have money. How much more are we going to borrow? Yes.
Because, you know, I think you're right about the whole Egbami, but also is that if you say we have flooding, then if you want to call out the West and say that you guys are contributing to climate change in a way that affects us, but
call
you
them
can't
out
add,
so that they feel responsible.
Yeah, but
then even after that, which is the point,
yeah.
even if they feel responsible, what is the component that you are doing? Are we saying that there are no successes at all? And that all that we rely on here is hope? Hope, as you know, as they say.
And how does the crisis in Gaza affect Africa?
Ukraine.
Ukraine. You know, with Ukraine, we understand with the grain shortages, with food shortages, and how it's affected oil prices and food prices across the world. But with Gaza, how are you relating it to Ukraine? Sometimes I feel like the people who present these talking points to the president just mumble and jumble things together and just throw everything. Did you speak
example, by the way, or
just
did
throw
you
it
read
all on a paper?
Of a teleprompter or something?
I believe that was prompted.
To just come in here, 3 things that stood out for me, you know, just listening to, I mean, we couldn't take the full speech from the president, but there are 3 things. Of course, the creation of this alliance that's supposed to be the global alliance against hunger and poverty that we've touched on extensively. He also emphasized the urgent need for the United Nations Security Council Council reform to ensure that it's continued relevance, and of course adding more African countries to the Security Council, and of course finally reforming the international financial architecture, especially in the digital economy space, where in the global south we're continuing to see this continuous overtaxing of African countries, or will I say third world countries. But to, tie it all in back to the point about this global eradication of hunger and poverty, we have to look at our Minister of Humanitarian Affairs and Poverty Alleviation. We started out with Betta Edu. We saw what happened. She was sharply booted out and then now replaced by Nentawe Goshwe Yiu Watada. Now he's come into this space, and you're going on the wall today, you're talking about poverty alleviation, but then what exactly is the ministry that is responsible for poverty alleviation in the country actually doing? This is, it started off in Buhari's time in 2016. There was the Power, I believe. There was so many other...
I don't think a ministry can eradicate poverty. What they do is
not that they can
dash out.
Yeah, not that they can eradicate it, but what are you keep talking about the body language of the president.
Yeah.
If you're responsible, if you're coming into a space and you're saying that, oh, this is the problems that we have, and you have a ministry that should be able to help, and you are not seeing the steps that they are taking to actually help people. About 8 months ago, they said they were going to give people 25,000 naira over a space.
They said they gave 25 million people 25.
Yeah, but what exactly?
The finance minister said so.
Conditional
A lot of opera on the internet, on social media, to say that if you know anybody around you or around your community that got 25,000,
5 million people.
It's sad, really, when you think about the fact that since he's come into power, we now have 63% of Nigerians actually living below the poverty line.
And I get your point, Sheita, that if the trajectory of the poverty eradication will follow the same old story of we're dashing people money, largely people that many people can't trace.
Yes.
What precisely are we doing, in terms of poverty eradication? And I don't think that ministry has a role in today's government. I don't think that ministry would do anything meaningful, to...
we're still talking about the president. Barely 48 hours after receiving a fresh loan request from President Bola Tinubu for $2.2 billion, approximately 1.767 trillion naira, the National Assembly this week promptly approved the loan. President Tinubu had on Tuesday, in separate letters to both chambers of the National Assembly, requested for approval of the fresh loan to fund the 9.7 trillion deficit in the 2024 budget. Arise correspondent Omo Bazwaye tells us more.
2 days after receiving President Bola Tinubu's request seeking approval for a fresh loan of 1.767 trillion naira, which is equivalent of $2.2 billion, the National Assembly grants the president permission to borrow the money.
Those in favor of the report as submitted by the chairman, local and foreign, please say aye. Aye. Those against say nay, the ayes have it.
Consider the reports of the Committee on AIDS, Loans and Debt Management, and request for approval for the implementation of the new external borrowing of 1767610321779, equivalent of $2.209 billion in the 2024 Appropriation Act through the issuance of Eurobonds and other sources, and approve recommendation 1 to 5 of the report.
National Assembly approval comes after a careful consideration of the report of the committees on local and external debt from both chambers. The National Assembly committees are satisfied with plans to secure the loans through the issuance of Eurobond, as well as plans to use the money to complete ongoing projects in the 2024 budget and stabilize the economy on the path of sustainable growth and development.
The committee urges the Senate to approve this request to enable the effective financing of 2024 budget and support Nigeria's long-term economic growth.
That the House do consider the report of Committee on AIDS, Loans and Debt Management on request for approval for the implementation of the new external borrowings of 1,767,321,777 naira 0 kobo.
The National Assembly commended the committees for expeditiously working on the President's request in barely 48 hours. But the National Assembly approval comes despite strong pushback from notable civil society organizations like Civil Society Legislative Advocacy, CISLAC, who feared that the borrowing could undermine Nigeria's fiscal stability and risk pushing the country into debt trap. Omo Bazwai, Arise News.
Well, 1.767 trillion naira approved in, wow, very, very, very fast, I would say. And, you know, when you just look at it in the general economic sense, the potential benefits there could be, you know, bridging the budget deficit, improved public services, stabilizing the economy. However, we know that we have a large set of potential drawbacks for every time that we borrow to fund the budget. We have debt sustainability concerns. We have high debt servicing costs. Nigeria already spends a significant portion of its revenue on debt servicing, leaving very little for developmental projects. There's also this lack of transparency and accountability, long-standing concerns, like we heard Omo Bazwai said, the pushback about the effective utilization of these borrowed funds in Nigeria. Mismanagement, be it corruption, always results in minimal benefits reaching the average citizen. And then the burden on future generations as well, because we keep borrowing to finance deficits without the corresponding revenue growth risk, leaving future generations like you and I actually burdened with this debt if we're not seeing the government actively looking for ways to actually generate this money. So we have to consider these three questions, I believe. How would the funds be used? I mean, there's been a breakdown, but not just that general one that we see. A clear, detailed plan to ensure that the loan actually addresses critical sectors with desirable outcomes. What are the terms of the loan? Because it's always very general. Do we have low interest? What is the long repayment plan? And how exactly are we being able to mitigate this risk? And finally, what, like I said, are the government's strategy for revenue generation? We can't keep borrowing money without looking within to figure out how we can diversify the economy to make sure that we're not, because this money keeps going higher and higher. I was looking at all the loans 6 loan projects that have already been approved under President Tinubu. Loans.
What are your worries?
That's because he's 4 years old.
Could it be about the breakdown that, you know, at the rate that we are going,
yes,
each Nigerian will have to pay close to 600,000, you know, at 220 million people.
A large amount of money, because we keep seeing these loans. We saw loans for power, $750 million. We are not seeing any improvements in the power sector. Women empowerment, $500 million. I don't know, I'm feeling quite empowered at the moment. Renewable energy, economic stabilization reforms, all of these loans keep coming up in dollars, looking at the depreciation of the naira. And again, like I said, it will fall on future generation. So,
well, I mean, your fears are understandable. You know, anytime we hear things about borrowing and stuff, of course, people will develop, you know, become apprehensive. And of course, it's a lot worrying because this is almost at the end of November. We are borrowing 1.7 trillion plus to fund the deficit in the current budget. And then we know that the 49 trillion of next year's budget coming, the budget deficit of it is anything around between 11 and 13, trillion or something. We will have to borrow more, next year. My problem is not that we're borrowing, given the fact that it will be easy for government to defend that our debt ratio to GDP is still within acceptable limit. But then what will be correct will be, what are we using it for, on the one hand? And on the other hand, what sort of budgeting are we doing on an annual basis that is not impacting positively, as many people will have wanted, on the lives of the people, yet we keep borrowing to fund, the deficit. If you look at 2024, for example, it looks to me like nothing spectacular will change, which probably explains why the president is saying that, I know that things are tough, possibly getting tougher, but you just have to be patient. Patiently waiting for hope, if you know what I mean. Because at the end of the day, at what point will there be a turnaround? IMF does not seem to see it. World Bank thinks that it might be anything around between 10 and 15 years. If you are a civil servant at a certain level, you'll be thinking, by the time things will turn around positively, I'll probably be retiring or something. So it is tough. It is tough, and I hope that there are better alternatives, because economics all over the world is about pursuing better alternatives.
I think, I agree with you, and I just going off of that civil servant example, beyond waiting 10 to 15 years, if you're doing 101 because you can't have 3 square meals a day, that's what a lot of Nigerians are facing. The fact that people cannot afford to feed themselves breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now, with the borrowing...
75% of the country.
Most of the country. Now, with the borrowing, it's very important that we highlight that borrowing is towards the 2024 budget. Part of why it passed so freely through the National Assembly is because it's already been accounted for in the 2024 appropriation budget that we passed. Now we have questions to ask. Why is it that in November we're trying to borrow money for the 2024 budget after the FEC has approved the 2025 appropriation request that they're going to send to the National Assembly? We already this year ran 3 budgets concurrently. Yeah. Where, Juma Ibrahim came out and said that, we even need to borrow this, we need to even borrow more. And the truth of the matter is that, we did speak about it last week, is that Nigeria's budget is incredibly small for a country of this size. We are broke. We are actually the boy with the empty pockets and torn shukutu at this point in time. Because our budgets cannot, seriously, our budget cannot even compete with the budgets of other African countries who have a fraction of the size of our population. Now, what the most important thing for me about our budget, because they've outlined how they're going to spend it. And most of the time when they apply for these loans, if you see the loan documents, they go to the letter to explain how they are going to apply these monies. The problem is that they do not apply it in those ways.
Zero implementation.
And so for me, if the government wants to say, because we are now borrowing money for projects that we have borrowed money for in the past. Mm-hmm. If the government is saying that money was spent, like, for example, the 20 billion that we've spent on refineries and we cannot see any refinery, if they're saying that it was misspent, there was corruption, then we must see people pay for those things before you borrow money for the exact same projects.
Absolutely.
There is no consequences for bad action in Nigeria, and we cannot keep going the way we've been going before, because obviously it's not working.
It's not. All right, let's proceed. The future of northern Nigeria took center stage at a roundtable organized this week by the Sir Ahmadu Bello Memorial Foundation in Abuja. The event, attended by Vice President Kashim Shettima, northern governors, traditional and religious leaders, focused on youth development, security, and socioeconomic challenges in the region. President Bola Tinubu, represented by Vice President Shettima, stressed that Nigeria cannot prosper unless every part of the country thrives. He called for unity to tackle insecurity and foster growth. In his address, the Sultan of Sokoto, Muhammad Saad Abubakar, stressed the critical need for educational reform, saying the nation's future rests on empowering youth through knowledge. All right, an important event there during the week, speaking about what everybody knows is a major issue affecting the northern part of Nigeria, quality education, lack of education for everybody, out-of-school children. I like the fact that the president was represented there by the vice president, who is a northerner, and the message is clear. The country cannot prosper if every part of the country is not thriving. I hope, and we've had many guests on this show, particularly Professor Usman, who's an important figure and voice from the north, saying that yes, we can blame present government all they like, but then you can also run away from the fact that many northern leaders have failed Northerners, given the way that they have allowed, so much endemic poverty arising out of, very low access to quality education. So I like the fact that attention was placed on that reality, and with governors there, with the vice president there, with traditional rulers there. Let's hope that things will at least begin to change for the better, given this type of quality conversation around education in the North. What are your thoughts very quickly before
all I have to say is last year in 2023, the World Bank gave President a $700 million loan for education in Nigeria. So I would like to know exactly how that $700 million loan was actually like part of that budget, how it's going to be used in the North, especially when we look at like education. One of the things that we're just talking about is how we continue to take these huge amounts of money and we don't actually see how it's spent. We know that in the North, we have the highest number of out-of-school children, and we know that it's directly linked to insecurity. But this in itself just seems like another like generic conversation without actual steps that are being taken. There are no barely existent primary schools, barely existent secondary schools, even the federal schools. I went to a federal school and I remember being very proud, back in the day, pro unitate, it was a thing of honor to be able to go to your federal government college in your state or even in a different state, but that's not the case anymore. We have more private schools popping up and it's those that can afford it. So how exactly within the budget are we seeing these money that has been set aside for education being spent and being focused? We're seeing northern leaders discussing education. Yeah. That's great. But how exactly are you planning to actually make sure that these out-of-school children find their way back into the classrooms? And that's the only question I have to ask our leaders this
Definitely.
morning.
As I mentioned earlier, talking about our out-of-school population in Nigeria is one of the worst in the world, if not the worst. And the thing is, when we talk about education, people often don't consider that what we are talking about is a ticking time bomb. If you have children who cannot read and write, who are unemployable or unemployed, if you have insecurity, if you have extremism, if you have global warming, climate shocks that we're facing, and you have people who can't go to the farms due to insecurity or cannot go to the farms due to desertification in the North, what we are talking about is a ticking time bomb of insecurity, of people's lives being lost, of people not being able to meet the global, standard, not just being able to work in Nigeria, but being able to work across the world, because we're in a very global economy. Where at one hand we're talking about AI, and on the other hand we're talking about millions of children in Nigeria cannot read and write, and also don't have food in their bellies when they wake up in the morning or go to bed at night. And so this crisis that we're talking about needs actual tackling. And so that is why I understand what you're saying, in that, okay, we are talking about it and we are talking about it, but what are we doing? Because the most important thing is that the people in power doing action. I do feel kind of exhausted about hearing people talk about our problems, because we know the problems. We've had them for a long time.
They're exhausting.
They're exhausting. But another thing, we can wax lyrical about out-of-school children. I can make it a talking point today, and our president can make it a talking point in Brazil. But at the end of the day, that doesn't change anything. That does not move the needle unless there is action.
It doesn't change much. That's true. Move from talk shop, to action point.
I wish it
could be as fast as the approval of that budget, don't you think? That would be nice. But let's move on to our next story. The self-acclaimed leader of the proscribed indigenous people of Biafra, Simon Ekpa, has been arrested by law enforcement in Finland. Reports say Ekpa was subsequently sent to prison by the District Court of Päijät-Häme for spreading terrorist propaganda on social media. Ekpa was said to have committed the crime in 2021 in the Lahti municipality. Now, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation also arrested 4 other men over alleged terrorist offenses. Now, Ekpa, who is a citizen of both Finland and Nigeria, has described himself as the leader of the separatist IPOB group since Nnamdi Kanu's incarceration. Finnish police say Ekpa's activities and social media rhetoric may have fanned the flames of violence in the southeast of Nigeria. I mean, we do know about Simon Ekpa. He rose to prominence back in July 2021 after the arrest of Nnamdi Kanu. But I think at this point, we spoke about him a lot on TMS, wondering why he's been able to hide how he's able to hide in Finland and be able to influence what's happening in the southeast. Over and over again, there was repeated calls, even by Nnamdi Kanu himself, who was behind bars, to put a stop to the insistent violence that happens in there. The stay-at-home order, which it wasn't followed at Delhi, was leading to loss of lives, more children being out of school. So my question now is, or the question that is kind of circling in social media spaces, is now that he's been arrested, are we going to see kind of a less of an involvement from him, seeing how he influences what's happening in the southeast? Is it going to, stop all the back and forth that is happening? I believe so, but then we know that sometimes when you cut off the head of the snake, sometimes two heads might grow in its place. Yeah. So it's not just about arresting him, but also making sure that because I'm sure he doesn't work alone. He's all the way in Finland. There are people that carry out those instructions. So as he's been arrested, let there also be consequences for the men on ground that have been pushing his agenda forward as well. Absolutely.
But I totally agree with you. And in few words, I think that I commend the diplomatic pressure that Nigeria exerted on the Finnish authorities because it took a long while. People were just thinking, they'll pick him up and everything. He's a Finnish citizen, so it's not going to be as straightforward as people were expecting. But finally, here we are. He's been arrested. He's been charged to court. Discussions are ongoing to the possibility of him being extradited, even though Nigeria and Finland, do not have, that sort of treaty. But of course, the law can take its course. Even over there, and like you have rightly said, yes, we've caught Simon Ekpa. Nnamdi Kanu is in prison, but the atrocities that utterances attributed to them, even though Nnamdi Kanu has changed his course, lately, we see what they're causing. So I think that the law should go the whole log to deal with Simon Ekpa, who has been alleged to be behind it, so that others like him can be discouraged, can be aware there are consequences. And I think that it is the sort of atrocities that is causing, particularly in the southeast of Nigeria, that should be the issue that people are talking about, as concerning the Igbos, not who's able to buy or sell ancestral land and things like that, that is everywhere in a manner that is just disturbing to people. Let people chill and be reasonable about issues like this.
Yeah. I very much appreciate that you said that, because people do need to be very reasonable about issues like this. And people need to be very reasonable about the fact that the people who have suffered the most from IPOB atrocities are Igbo people in the southeast. The people, the children who are not able to write their exams because there was a stay-at-home order. The people who lose money because they can't go to work.
Are being killed every Monday.
Businesses are being, the people who can't go home to marry or to bury their elders because they're afraid due to insecurity in the southeast. I am happy that he has been carried. And I also hope that this sends a signal to Nigerians in the diaspora who feel that they are, because they are not in the country, they can then stir the pot.
From,
You are not, and I hope, and I appreciate what, as you pointed out, particularly the importance of the diplomatic pressure Nigeria put here. And I hope we continue to put it, because there are people who think they can go to Canada or run to Toronto or run to London and stir up tribal agendas
Absolutely.
And it is very dangerous. It is very ridiculous. And I hope that we continue to make examples out of terrorists. Because you should not be able to sit at home drinking hot chocolate in Finland and cause havoc.
Especially because you think that I'm a Canadian citizen. I'm a British citizen.
You should not be able to have your hot cocoa and be sitting down in the snow and be and tell people in Nigeria that they cannot leave their homes.
Absolutely. Well said, that is well.
Well, that is all on stories making the rounds this week.